Good evening. Welcome to Franklin Public Library's 2025 Great Decisions, sponsored by the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, and Carol and Tom Donovan. Tonight's speaker is John Katzka. I feel like he's been a regular and you all probably know him, but I'm gonna...
And you came back.
Yeah. He's a retired senior Foreign Service officer with 37 years of federal and foreign service experience. He's also a Wisconsin native and graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Tonight, he's here to talk about a very timely topic, American foreign policy at a crossroads. So I'm going to turn it over to John.
I've got the clicker. Aha. I'm getting older, so I'm going to sit while I'm doing this. Halfway through the 80s. Well, delighted to be back with you again. Let me start with another way to look at foreign affairs. Those of you who have heard me before know about my idealist and realist. You've heard it before. It's a way in which foreign affairs can be viewed. Either are right or wrong. Idealists are focused on our values, on what we stand for, democracy, human rights. Realists focus on our national interests, more pragmatic. And as I said, neither is right or wrong, but both need to pay attention to something called costs and consequences. And that needs to be decided on before they make a decision to get involved in an issue. We're not particularly good at that. We rush in with our hearts, and then we find out that our brain isn't focusing in this very well, and we have made a mess of a few things over the last 30 years. Another thing we need to look at is culture. We have a culture. In fact, we probably have 4 or more cultures in the United States. And some of that we can see every time we disagree with people from other parts of the country. But getting in the head of someone from another culture can help you understand where they're coming from, so you can gauge that. We refer to these people as being irrational because they don't have our sense of rationality. If you crawl inside someone else's culture, you begin to understand it. You begin to understand where they're coming from. And then you can begin to make your policies appropriate without overreaching. And the other thing is, if anyone is here tonight for a black and white solution to the situation, you've come to the wrong place. Foreign affairs is shades of gray, lots of those little consequences that impede and make situations very, very unhappy indeed. So what's going on in our world? The great decisions people call it a crossroad. Other people are calling it chaos. It's probably a little bit of both. John Eichelberry, who was a professor at Princeton and a former member of the State Department's policy planning staff, a distinction he shares with a Milwaukeean, George Kennan. If you remember George Kennan. George Kennan was the architect of the containment policy in the early 50s when we were battling with the Soviet Union. He's the author of the essay in the Great Decisions booklets, and there are copies over there, that is available in the library. I borrowed broadly from Eikenberry's essay and Jeff Morton, who did a master class on this very topic for Great Decisions, and putting my talk together. I see my purpose tonight is to give you a broad understanding of our experiences over the last 30 years, our current dynamics with the election of Donald Trump, and a little bit on the road ahead. Eikenberry begins his essay with the words that are increasingly being broadcast here and abroad. The U.S., polarized and divided, faces a world overflowing with challenges, dangers, and uncertainties. Well, that's a little bit of our domestic situation too, isn't it? I plan to reinforce that warning, something I have been doing for over a decade, though I will admit I didn't see all the different kinds of trees in that big forest of foreign affairs. And I'm referring to that old adage about you can't see the forest for the trees, meaning, for those of you who don't know it, it means you're so focused on individual crises that you can't pull back to be able to see what's happening, where it's going, and what else is happening. Former President Biden kicked off his 4 years in the White House by inviting democratic countries to organize themselves against rising autocratic regimes. The definition of democratic state for his purposes at that time was very loose, with a willingness to attend being important. The democracy club is relatively easy to get into, but learning all the rules of membership can be complicated, and criticism is quickly given. Yes, the autocracies are talking to each other as well. There is a loosely defined group that is being called the Gang of Four: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Not to be confused with the Quad, which is a grouping of the US, Australia, Japan, and India organized to confront China in Asia. Lots of little groups, and I'll get into some of those. Globalization is not dead, but in need of life support. China and Russia principally want to change the rules that we put into effect after World War II. Our domestic situation is fractured, with as much as 35 to 40% of the population on either extreme, with little cohesion in the middle. That makes it very difficult to be more than tactical and reactive in foreign affairs. And that is what we have been doing for more than a decade, stumbling from one crisis to another with little attention to those costs and consequences of our actions. The idea that politics ends at the nation's shores is over. What had been a debate among moderates with differing approaches and understandings of those many shades of gray that make up foreign affairs is over for now. There are a lot of questions we can ask ourselves about what we should or could be doing in our role in world affairs. Can we reconstruct the global order that we largely put into effect after World War II? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen quite the way we would like it to happen, if that's our goal. Can we find a way to coexist with China and Russia as we did during the Cold War? Can we work with non-democratic states as we did during the Cold War? And I'll mention Zaire. I was in Zambia in the early 80s when this was definitely the Cold War period. Mobutu, who was one of the biggest criminals that you could ever imagine, was the president of Zaire. Well, he was our man because we recognized that if he were to collapse and Zaire, rich in minerals, would become an open area, and the chaos would spread to other parts of Africa as well. So we supported Mobutu to a degree, even though we knew he was a bad guy. Could we do that again? Can we find new institutions that have enough support to generate cooperation and action on global issues like climate change and technology concerns like AI? Well, we don't have those institutions right now. The United Nations, the General Assembly, is at best a place where people can make statements. The Security Council is divided along the veto powers of the two sides, with the Germans, the French and the English on one side, and China and the Russians on the other side, with all those other members that are in the Security Council with no votes at all. Can we recognize that we are not as dominant as we were at the end of the Cold War? And what is our desired or appropriate role going forward? Lots of questions. My job is to give you options on that big picture, but it's up to you to decide those answers after you hear from all the information that you're going to be getting over the next 8 weeks from all these wonderful programs that Jennifer's bringing to you. Let me warn you, there are no easy answers. For example, the war in Ukraine is a product of a number of considerations, some that began back in the 1600s, others that flowed from NATO expansion. Of course, there are egos and bruised feelings and missteps and misunderstandings and ignoring those costs and consequences that should be part of every action and policy before it becomes an action or policy. So what are the crises we face? Well, great power politics. Great power politics was the dynamo of European politics up until, well, pretty much up until the industrial age, into the industrial age. It was a group of countries that got together and kind of worked out the rules, and when the rules broke down, they fought against each other. It has been a factor in place for centuries where there have been near constant shifting of power. The challenge here is to figure out what they want and what we are prepared to change. Another factor in how our foreign affairs are put together, the information age, the technology that drives it, the interaction that it allows and threatens states and its citizens as they seek to prosper, be informed, and avoid being manipulated. Many states on the autocratic side of the house do not seek to make their citizens more prosperous. They seek to make their states more successful. Another factor is the vulnerability of liberal democracy. And I'm going to focus on something outside of the state relationships. And I'm going to look at multinational corporations and non-governmental organizations. They may have started in one country, but globalization has put these institutions largely outside the control of any nation state. Look at the multinational corporations that are increasingly unnationalistic about their goals, other than improving their quarterly reports. NGOs like Amnesty International report to no government and are forces for change that may or not be acceptable to some or even many states. The UN has no factor in working with these non-governmental organizations, nor with the multinational corporations. There are an increasing number of ways that states are connecting to like-minded nations and groups, or even applying the enemy of my enemy is my friend as a way to deal with internation relations. You heard about that, enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's tactical, but it works. That last category could describe about the internation relations, could describe India, which you're going to be hearing about, where we are with the Chinese, they are with us against China in the Quad, as I mentioned earlier, and friendly with Russia for energy reasons and a whole bunch of things else outside of that, as well as becoming increasingly more autocratic and Hindi-focused at home. To the democracies versus autocracies clash, I would add one more component, the global South, which probably leans towards the autocracies, but for a range of reasons wants to keep its distance, much like the non-aligned movement in the 60s and 70s, before many of you were born, I think. When Nehru, Tito, Nasser, Nkrumah, and Sukarno, leaders that some of you may recall, sought to stay out of the Cold War, and where membership in that non-aligned movement was only from those outside of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Politics certainly underlies many of the concerns of this threatened and changing world, but the clash of cultures is important. Right at the end of the Soviet Union, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And basically what he's talking about was the various large cultural groups. And he referred to China, Russia, and the Slavic nations of Russia. And there you see, even within the EU, that some of the Slavic nation stuff comes up as well as Brussels tries to maneuver them. In the information age, it is supposed to work to homogenize world's cultures, to make us feel more comfortable with each other. I would suggest that it hasn't been doing a very good job so far. I'll give you a lot of perspectives tonight. This is all material that you're going to hold over for the next 7 weeks, that you're going to come in and blast these people who come up here and say, well, what about this? And you're going to look and they're going to say, wow, what an educated audience. Another perspective of our troubled world. First of all, this isn't the first time we face these kinds of difficulties. In the run-up to World War I, we had a conflict between Wilsonian internationalism versus America First isolationists. Then after World War II, we had serious discussions about the UN and our role in the world, though that debate happened with moderates on both sides, not our present condition. Finally, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have been all over the map in approaches as the sole superpower. So let me get those approaches since 1992, and we'll lay them out in 4 competing, sometimes overlapping ways we have dealt with the last 30 years. Liberal internationalism has been the dominant approach. It works with the idea that cooperation is possible. There is an expectation of peace. It is defined by laws and organization. And democracy and capitalism are the desired tools. The next one, conservative realpolitik, is applied occasionally and regionally, like in the Middle East, where other approaches weren't working. Countries are ranked by military might. There are no permanent allies in this approach. There is an expectation of war. That certainly is the Middle East. And often a rejection of free trade. Neoconservatism, which came out of Ronald Reagan's period. The neoconservatives, or neocons as they're called, were Democrats, principally from the New York area, who felt that the Democratic Party at that time was too soft on communism, on the Soviet Union. And they moved over to the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan. They hold that all great powers are a threat to the US. They hold that democracy is a natural condition. And this particular approach is a high-risk, high-cost foreign policy. And now we have a new one again, called America First. Puts the US first. A century ago, we were called isolationists, but that is only a fraction of the present group that are part of America First. It does not want foreign entanglements. Adversaries are not so bad. Allies are not so good. Non-interventionist policy, stay out of other people's wars. Tariffs and trade wars are a preferred tool. We're seeing a little bit of that in evidence right now. When we ask basic questions that affect international relations, and those will be on, I'll get into that. We'll begin to see how these four approaches interact and affect foreign policy. And I'm getting a little wonky here. So bear with me, but it's going to make you so much better people at the end of this. On internationalism and interventions, okay? America First is against it, where liberal internationalists and conservative realpolitikers and neocons would be for. Okay? On democracy promotion, which is very much under fire in Washington right now, liberal internationalists and neocons are for. The conservative realpolitikers and and America Firsters would be against. So you can see as issues come up, you can't say that one is going to be the preferred because we have conflicting issues that are working against each other. On free trade, conservative realpolitikers and America Firsters are against it. And liberal internationalists are strongly for it, while neocons are somewhat supportive. Law and organizations, you know what the liberal internationalists are going to be for that. All the rest are against. So, okay, we looked at the theoretical approach to the world. Let's try another template. This makes you even, this gets you out into the world, geography. We can look at the world geographically. Okay, we could take care of our neighborhood. That might be a real smart idea. Focus on our relations with Mexico and Canada and the Caribbean. Or we could expand that to include South America, for example. Or we could focus on Asia. The problem we have had is we wanted to focus on it all. That as a sole superpower and one who engaged everywhere, all of those were important. There's a priority list there, but it changes. Okay, let's look at the case for Latin America. One of the reasons to do that is proximity. It's easy enough. Culturally, we're rather similar. It also is distant from other powers. No one else other than China, which is everywhere now too, to interfere. We have some issues that we have in common: trade, immigration, and drugs. And we can occasionally find common ground. And I say only occasionally because often our foreign policy is, as soon as we get involved in Latin America, they don't like us as much. The case for Europe. Oh, I was supposed to move. That was the Latin American one. I'll leave these slides with you in case someone might want. Okay, this is the next one. The case for Europe. Historic anchor of U.S. foreign policy. We are fellow members of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, which includes all the countries of Europe and a few of North America, and of NATO. NATO has been one of the reasons NATO has been important to us is because it gives us a role in European affairs, other than our national security concerns. We have a common security outlook and interest, and if you add the Aussies and New Zealand to the mix, you're actually setting up a very interesting grouping. The case for Asia. Currently, everything in Asia begins with China. But also, India is a key player and a competitor to China. And Japan, also a key player, and like India, a competitor to China. We have alliances in the region, ANZUS, which is America, New Zealand, no, Australia. It's a natural mistake. Australia, New Zealand, and the US as part of ANZUS. And we have the Quad that I mentioned already twice with India and Japan and Australia and the United States. And we have the Five Eyes, the 5 English-speaking countries, which is done as an area where we share intelligence. And focusing on Asia would be that pivot that several administrations have tried to do, going back to W and then Obama, that wanted to try to pivot to Asia and to get away from the Middle East. What about mixing and matching those theoretical and the geographical? Now I'm getting truly wonky, and I apologize. Again, nothing is black and white, but regarding Europe, the conservative realpolitik seems to be the best fit for our policies with Europe. For Asia, it might be surprising, America first would be the better approach. Latin America, it's liberal internationalism. And for Africa, all but the neoconservative approach. The neoconservatives aren't interested in Africa. I think you can see it is near impossible to come up with a common approach for every place in the world where we have interest or become concerned because of our values. So this is what confronted every president stepping into that office. It's actually easier to be a major power than it is to be the great powers. And the sole superpower, no one loves the sole superpower. Now for our final template. Oops. Another way to size up the world is the power game. And starting with the great powers. And what are they? Large, impressive, force projectable, broad interests. Respected by others as a great power. America, China, and Russia, though there are questions about Russia right now. Next would be the major powers. The EU, India, Brazil, though individual EU countries might see themselves there. In fact, there's individual European countries like Germany and France that are not likely to let the EU speak for them in this regard. The EU, as you know, started as an economic entity and tried not, since the end of the Cold War, to become a political entity and is having troubles.
Question?
Yes.
Would you put Great Britain in that group? Excuse me.
Yeah. All of them, Great Britain, France, and Germany, all are limited. All three were once major powers. And some of that legacy still messes with their minds, especially the French. That is a broad conceptual that is the broad conceptual part of the program. You can can rest now. It's going to be a little easier. Now I'll get into specific influences that are affecting our world. Gave you a sneak peek at that one, but 2024 was the year of elections, most significantly in Europe. Over the last year, we have seen changes because of those leadership elections that are having an important impact affecting U.S. foreign policy. Of note is the growth of right-wing parties in Europe. 7 EU countries, Austria, Italy, Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, and the Czech Republic, have hard right parties in government, and there are several more on the edge of that, including, flirting with this outcome, is Germany and France. Driving this sharp movement to the right are migrant and refugee issues, and the EU's green policies that led to widespread farmer demonstrations across Europe last summer. And let's not ignore a general unhappiness with the current elites. Remember that I already started that. See, that's the whole trouble when I start getting off cool. I was going to start talking about Europe started as an economic union. Well, I already told you that one. In that process of moving to a political organization, the EU bureaucracy has tried to homogenize the rules, the culture of Europe, so that there is a common sense of what it is to be a European. This effort has not gone down with enthusiasm with most of the East European members who lived under Soviet rule as part of the Warsaw Pact for quite a number of decades. They became unhappy with Brussels' heavy-handed cultural definitions. The rise of nationalism in several member states and the political problems in France and Germany suggest that the EU is likely to be internally focused, at least in the short term. The Gang of Four. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have no formal alliance committed to defending one another. However, they have common interests and understandings, and they are driven by a shared unhappiness toward the world order that we put into place after World War II. For the historians in the audience, the Gang of Four was the name given to the 4 senior Chinese officials, including Mao's wife, associated with the Cultural Revolution's most radical features. 50 years later, as Richard Haas, who's at a distinguished academic and connected to what's it called? The Council of World Affairs, has observed, a new Gang of Four has emerged. This gang seeks to prevent the spread of Western liberalism domestically, meaning they don't want our people coming in there and telling them how they should become more democratic. They see this as a threat to their hold on power and to the authoritarian political systems they had. They also oppose U.S. leadership abroad, including the norms the U.S. and its partners embrace. It is a clash. The gang's mutual support takes several forms. On the eve of the invasion of Ukraine in February of 22, China signed an agreement with Russia declaring that their mutual friendship had no limits, while Russia expressed support for China's position vis-a-vis Taiwan. Since then, China has echoed Russian talking points about the war in Ukraine, blaming NATO for it and amplifying Russian misinformation. Trump in October suggested he was going to work to separate Russia from China, reversing what Nixon and Kissinger orchestrated in the 1970s, where they pulled China away from the Soviet Union's orbit. China, even with that warm embrace of Russia that I just mentioned, has been careful to keep its economic and trade interests from interfering with their political military relations with Russia. There is a perverse set of consequences. That word consequences keeps coming up in international relations. Maybe it comes up everywhere. That occurs in the interaction between the Gang of Four and the U.S. and its allies. Sanctions are applied to limit an adversary's ability to act. As an economic power, that's a useful tool. Russia invades Ukraine and wholesale sanctions are issued. First of all, the utilities of sanctions is suspect. Not only the sanctioned country, but the sanctioner, its allies, and interested others are negatively affected and often find ways to undermine those sanctions. Oil that was previously sold to Europe starts moving east to China and India. No one can explain how so much Russian oil and gas still ends up in Europe today. Further, there are consequences to those sanctions that help deepen the relationship among the gang's members. Relatedly, those sanctions are leading to the development of new financial relations, further weakening the international economic order. And as I was preparing this, I got just came across my desk 2 days ago. Another capsule of this Crossroads thing comes out in an exchange between Senator Mitch McConnell and Reed Smith, who's a vice president at Stand Together, which I think is a MAGA kind of group. I believe somehow linked, I believe that Smith is linked to the Trump administration. McConnell, in his January-February 2025 Foreign Affairs issue. You have Foreign Affairs at the library?
We'll take a donation of it.
Very expensive.
Not that, no. But if the library has it, you don't have to have a copy. Just get a subscription, right? Okay. I don't get any commissions for doing that. In his recent essay, warned that our 4 years of weakness will be replaced by 4 years of isolation. Well, as a Republican, he's of course going to say hardly say nice things. We don't say nice things about the other party anymore. He called for a restoration of industrial capacity to sustain American military predominance indefinitely. This is McConnell speaking. It is fair to say McConnell favors hard power as the cornerstone of American leadership and favors increasing defense budgets to that end. Smith responded that after 2 decades of fruitless wars that drained American resources and destabilized vital regions, political leadership requires prioritizing core national interests. A realist, as you can hear. Not endlessly underwriting the security of, and the word he used was dependence. I think he was thinking of Europe. Smith counters the isolation charge by noting that the overextension of our resources invites decline and has contributed to the massive national debt we keep on growing. And I don't hear either political party getting caught up on dealing with that huge national debt we have. McConnell was asked to respond. He allowed that the spiraling national debt does threaten American strength, but he wasn't willing to do anything particularly to reduce it, but argued that defense spending isn't the place to find savings. This exchange is not a hard read on the relative roles of idealists and realists, because there's a little bit of both in McConnell's and Smith's positions, a condition that often happens. I would say that after reading their comments and other things that they have written or endorsed, that Smith is more the realist and McConnell the idealist, but not by much. Okay, now we've been waiting for this. Final observations. In 2 hours I should be done. The rest of this decade will be influenced by Wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, neither area is likely to be resolved quickly because in both cases, neither side is going to be happy with the outcome of any ceasefire or armistice. Yes, the political shift to the right in Europe is important. There is an assault on the current world order led by the Gang of Four, and it will continue. And when they come up with alternative currency exchanges, trading mechanisms, adjustments will have to be made, and I'm not sure how that's going to work. The UN is not capable of dealing with structuring it, advancing it. The clash of the democracies and autocracies will see more movement in the global South countries than in the core of the democracies and autocracies. There's no question that technology and AI's influence is growing. What Trump's new foreign affairs policy and which institutions, well, this is supposed to be a question. What is Trump's new foreign policy? And which world institutions will be useful? We can get into that in the question period a little bit. Eikenberry, the author of this booklet for this program, sees three main approaches possible in the future. Obviously, the existing order would be nice. That would mean we would get, there's a economic philosopher by the name of Ricardo who talked about comparative advantage. And you should, whatever you can produce the best at the cheapest is wherever that can be, that's where it should happen. Well, now in a clashing world, that doesn't work out. And as the pandemic showed us in terms of how supply chains, in fact, I don't even know that the word was in the English language before the pandemic, but now it's that universities are giving degrees in supply chains. The existing order, where the U.S. still defines and exercises a great deal of influence, I would hold that some to many changes are inevitable. Trump, Make America Great Again approach, which many see America pulling back from leading and defining the international order and focusing on deals and crises. Donald Trump is not a strategic thinker. He's a deal maker. And so he is not going to be, he's looking at who am I going to deal with and what is the outcome I want. He's not going to be too much bothered by what they say they want. We have no idea, even if he's successful in doing some of this for his 4 years, whether this approach will survive Trump as we teeter between the two opposing domestic outlooks and the policies going forward. Of course, the third option is a compromise. Eikenberry is a very savvy person. A bit of both the liberal internationalism and Trump America First approaches that Eikenberry calls the Westphalian internationalism. Westphalia is important because it was the birth of the nation state. We didn't have nations before Westphalia. Is that 1600s?
1648.
Huh?
1648.
Thank you. Well, I know it's 1600s, close enough. A historian. Okay, I'll repeat that. What he calls Westphalian internationalism or progressive realism, in which we work with other countries across ideological and geopolitical divides, including Russia and China. We are not the only driver, but need to cooperate to get things done. This was a piece of the various phases of the Cold War. We did cooperate with the Soviet Union in various places. Not many, but some. and is my choice as the most desirable outcome, but not necessarily what will happen. What is hard to find in any of the options is a structure that will replace the UN, suggesting that it will limp along, useful through some of its several agencies, like UNICEF, but even in those areas, like UNIDO and UNESCO, which is very politically divided, I'm not sure if it has utility. The idea of reform appears near impossible with the way the Security Council is formed, and that neither we, with the Brits and the French on our side, nor the Russians and the Chinese will be willing to enlarge to include states we or they oppose, nor to give up the veto ability. All nations are watching to see how this crisis in international affairs evolves. I mentioned the various regional political groupings to watch. The BRICS, have you heard of the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is now, I'll get ahead of myself, the Gang of Four I mentioned, the Quad, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to name a few. Some of these groupings will show up in other presentations over the next several weeks. Weigh that presenter's perspective against mine. I have a perspective. I'm not giving you the truth. I'm not giving you the facts. I'm giving you a perspective. Modestly informed. Remember those idealist and realist definitions. I tend to lean towards the realist side, unless I'm with a dedicated realist, and then I slide to the idealist side of the ledger. It makes for more interesting conversations. I hope you are able to attend all of those presentations. They will offer you different perspectives based on what is happening in their subjects area, but also give you different perspectives from the speaker's point of view on that idealist, realist scale. And think about that cultural component and try to crawl inside the thinking of the country involved. What would you do if you lived there under their conditions? And finally, don't expect easy answers. If you find one, that means you haven't dug deeply enough into what is really going on. With that, I say thank you for your attention. And thank you to Jennifer and Franklin Library for organizing these important discussions. And now I'm going to slip up there and we'll have a nice discussion. Actually, I like the discussion parts best.
Hey, I've got the microphone and I can pass it around. A minute to settle down.
Yes.
I appreciate the discussion and the overview that you gave, but I felt there was one element that you didn't discuss that I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say about that. And that is the world leaders. You talked about the Gang of Four, but these leaders tend to change. And in the West, they tend to change with elections, but in the East, or in the autocratic, they tend to change with age. And there's some discussion right now that in China, Xi Jinping has got some hardliners that he's trying to maneuver with. There's been a lot of discussion that Putin has got some health issues. The Ayatollah is getting quite on in age, and who knows what's going on in North Korea. So I'd be curious to know or hear you comment on the human element in all of this.
I can't argue with your initial summation of the West uses elections to change the leaders. But I would say generally in more autocratic states, it is age that is the factor, but not always. Many of these states use elections as a way in which to promote a particular point of view. after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a wide range of political parties that were running and seeking to try to define what the next phase was. And it took a decade before they got any currency. I hold that the 1990s in Russia was a country suffering from PTSD. They were so overwhelmed by what had happened that, I mean, it's a little bit like what we're seeing in Washington, D.C. right now. And I'm getting feedback from my colleagues about how, you know, how stunned they are by what's happening. Yeah.
It's basically throw the bums out.
Well, there is a, I don't know if I got enough of an answer to your
You're
question.
commenting on the democracies, but you really haven't commented too much on the autocracies.
Because there's such a range. Autocracies are also oligarchies. I mean, oligarchies fit into the same category. And in China, I would say, is more of an oligarchy than an autocracy. I put China into 3 phases in the post-World War II period. Mao, Deng Xiaoping, who built the economic engine, and Xi Jinping now, who's going to use it. And whether or not, and it's interesting you mentioned hardliners with Xi's people, because Putin also has the same problem. If Putin would be replaced, it would not be by someone more accommodating, more likely by someone who would be even more aggressive in terms of pushing Russia's interests, as it is right now. So let me try to finish. Is that good?
I was going to ask you about autocrats. Isn't it kind of like a value system of valuing human life versus not valuing human life? That's how I look at autocrats. Is human life is disposable, or you know, the equality is not necessarily so, and we know what's right for you people, and it's not the people that knows what they need. I don't know.
No, you're not. I would put it. I'll give you a little more definition for it. We are the most aggressively individualistic country in the world. I don't think that's such a good thing, actually. That's kind of, that individualism is tearing apart the glue that holds us together. That's what bothers me in the domestic situation. But in Russia, for example, the individual is not important. It is the group. It starts with the family, the village, the nation. Those are factors. The individual is not an important factor. And the prosperity of individuals in this is not a goal in an autocratic state. So people, and this is, in Russia's case, this goes back. This is way back to the beginning. And in many parts of the world, this is the basic underlying social structure that when we come in to try to change that, we're not going to stay long enough and have enough resources to be able to make much difference, other than make some people unhappy, generally the leaderships. Yes?
Somebody else has a question. My other thought is, too, aren't some of these, the big 4 you were talking about, aren't they more for power? I mean, it's all right if they keep their own stuff in their own land, but they want, like Putin wants more. Isn't it now I've heard that it's resources they're looking for. We're going to be going into Somalia because they have lithium for our chips and stuff like that, that we're, I don't know if this stuff is true.
On the resource thing, we're all competing for those resources. This is not limited to the, China has been aggressive on this account. We're out there. The Europeans are out there, all trying to build those supply chains to make sure we're taken care of. So this is an apolitical kind of thing. I see the Ukrainian thing differently than our government does. I see the Ukrainian thing being Russia, after going out of PTSD of the 90s, recognizing that Ukrainians, except for that western part of Ukraine, which Stalin took from Poland and gave the Poles a piece of Germany in the process, except for that western part, had been part of the of Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union since 1654. The policies that were there were not Ukrainian policies, they were Russian policies. The language that I spoke when I traveled around central and eastern Ukraine, because I couldn't go over, they wouldn't allow us to travel to western Ukraine, was Russian. They all spoke Russian. Well, so I see the aggressiveness, and I know that NATO, this is part of NATO's reason for existing. It has to have a threat in order to be able to continue doing what it's doing. And when we began the longer, and then I talked about those perverse consequences, where every time we do something and they do something, we react and they react, we make those divisions even more solidified. And most of this global South leans towards autocracy. Their cultures are generally strong leaderships in the capitals that are running the countries. Yes.
First, I want to commend you on your initial comment about the clash of cultures, because if I understood you correctly, and I agree with this, our lack of being able to see the other side's perspective, for example, the Middle East crisis that's been going on for centuries, our American superiority of attitude has contributed to some of the issues not getting resolved. I mean, not responsible for them, but even the last 24 hours with the grand announcement of Trump wanting to bulldoze Gaza. So my question is, how are we, without getting into the personal political views, supposed to maintain our credibility with other nations, with other cultures, when we turn over every 4 years? What's here today is gone tomorrow.
Sure.
How is our credibility? I mean, Europe is making different plans based on Biden versus Trump, and who knows what the next 4 years after that will bring.
Agreed.
Could you comment on some of that, if you understood that?
Sure. Are you familiar with a term called American exceptionalism? It is something that we have held almost from the beginning, because we broke rules when we set up this country. What we kind of lost in that process is it's a good thing for us. It doesn't necessarily make it a good thing for everybody. The peoples who came here to settle in the United States were prepared to deal with this. They came out of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance in Europe, mostly. They were available, they were willing to take on these things. Our foreign policy would be, and this is where my realist side of the ledger would come out, would be more effective if we didn't preach as much. In my opening remarks, I said that democracy thing that Biden set up, it's relatively easy to say you become a democracy, but until you find out what the rules are and how much criticism you get when you don't fulfill it the way we want it to be fulfilled. And we have, and the Congress puts this stuff on the State Department and USAID to go out and do this stuff because they're filled with this kind of feelings, these values things. And values are great, and we should have our values. But it doesn't mean we have to go out and try to change other people on the basis. National interest is, I think, a more valuable way in which to look at it than in values are.
Isn't it a win-win? Isn't a good negotiator a win-win? Everybody takes away.
Well,
something
this is one of the areas where I think Donald Trump has problems because he goes into a negotiation with the idea of winning. Mm-hmm. And it is, at least it was, an axiom of foreign affairs negotiating that if both parties don't leave the negotiation with some feeling of success, that's a failed negotiation. And the best case in point is Clemenceau in World War I, the reparations that he put on Germany was a natural build-up to World War II. Come on. Yes. Are you the historian?
Me? No. A quick question. There's been a lot of pessimism tonight. What are some areas for optimism? Where are there some seeds globally for areas where we can build together and try to put this thing back together, in your opinion?
Just being here and being open to discussing these things, even though you may not necessarily agree with everything I said, you've got a perspective. Getting other perspectives is part of that process. Moving the discussion back to the middle is what we have to do for us. Now, this is happening at the same time I talked about Europe swinging to the right. I'm a big fan, in addition to having been a broken down old diplomat, I'm a futurist, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Milwaukee chapter of the World Future Society, which an organization that no longer exists, but we call ourselves that anyway. And one of my fascinations are cycles. The information age is part of a cycle. We went from the industrial to the information age. We go through a variety of different kinds of cycles. Most of the cycles that I look at put us in the winter of most of those cycles. The trouble with futurism is it's you can see where it's going, but there's no timelines. You don't know. Some people are, and it's, if you say next year, well, your credibility is just about shot. If you try to say within 10 years, well, you got 10 years to get to live with those remarks. If you say 20, you're in safer country. But cycles are, we're humans, and we go through these things. We never stop at that harmonious point that not everyone's going to love. No one else will never have a point where everyone is happy with what is going on. We have to accept that. But those that aren't happy cannot be angry. They can say, well, I had a sister-in-law who I don't watch the news anymore. It just makes me angry. Well, she dropped out. You can do that and not be part of the problem. I mean, everyone doesn't have to be engaged. We ran foreign policy up until probably the 60s out of the East Coast. It was an Ivy League. I had my basic officer course. The guy who was leading the course was was a retiring Princeton graduate, and he had his Princeton tie on. And more than once he bemoaned the fact of this broadening of the Foreign Service. Well, I'm sure that in the latter parts of my career there was another broadening that was occurring. That's not a play on words. Yes.
One of the problems of liberal internationalism was free trade. It was trying to amplify that in the free trade system, generally, whoever produced whatever product at the cheapest cost, that benefit the whole global system. But in that process, that destroyed certain industries in certain countries, including our own.
Sure.
The question is, how do you, and that repercussion is obviously felt as we go from election to election. How do you, in a sense, endorse free trade at the same time protect certain industries without protectionism or using tariffs?
Well, and I think it was in recent years, I think it is fair to say that we did not have free trade. Certain countries subsidized their exports, and I talked about those multinational corporations who were more concerned about their next quarterly report than they were about the jobs for the people that used to work for them. And then you have Johnson Controls, who sends their headquarters off to Ireland because it saves money and gives them a entry into the European market.
And a tax advantage.
And tax advantages as well. So all of these, everything works. Again, this is a cycle. You get to a point where, and there's also something about the elites. I'll fold them all in together. That a group of people build a structure. Then they begin to figure out how it works, and then they figure out how to take advantage of it. And that's clearly one of the things that's flowing into Trump's, a certain perception of Trump's supporters is this, down with the elites. This is also what's going on in Europe. They also figured out how to use it, not nearly to the same way. They don't have the conspicuous wealth issues that we have. But
what they really lack there is the disparities of wealth that we have here.
Or lack or joy.
Well, in Sweden, for example, it's now the top 1% owns 16% of the country.
Yeah.
In the U.S., the top 5 people or 5 families own about 40% of the U.S.
Sure. But I just saw a cartoon on Sweden where they just passed a increase in terms of the taxation of that wealthy.
Yeah.
And guess who has the greatest mobility with their money?
Yeah.
The wealthy.
Sure. Monaco is never going to close its doors.
You've obviously been in a lot of different countries around the world. And after World War II, many countries were...
I was alive, but I wasn't in Europe at the time.
I appreciate that. But many countries were hoping that we would have non-nuclear proliferation and there would only be a very small group of people who had their finger on the button, so to speak, or whatever way you want to describe making the decision about the use of nuclear arms.
Right.
Today, the world has many more countries with nuclear weapons. And at one time, there was a potential exchange between Pakistan and India. From your experience, having been around the world, should someone decide to use one of those weapons and it not be Russia or the United States, what's the probability that that nuclear exchange would
mushroom.
Thank you, for lack of a better term, that begins to start, I think the world is a much more dangerous place with so many people being able to make the decision about the use of such a weapon.
Well, just throw in a historical example. Who would have thought that the assassination of the crown prince in Sarajevo would have led to World War I?
Well, and then you put in non-nation states who
Yes.
are beginning to be involved in world politics, and the terrorist organizations around the world beginning to provide influence in how world events start happening.
Sure. Yes. I do a program in Cedarburg called Tracking the World's Hotspots. And so, in fact, Peter Kranstover, who is going to come and talk to you about India, is spent almost as much time as I did in the Foreign Service, but with USAID. So he was more on the functional side. I was more on the loquacious side. This and all of these things build up. That's why I'm talking about these perverse consequences. Each time we do something to punish Russia, the four and some of their friends push back on us. So these are hardening of positions, and we're in the early phase of deciding where a particular country wants to be. Who are we going to support? Where are our interests in this process? I mentioned the Shanghai cooperative, Shanghai. Let's call it this Shanghai. Russia and China are the linchpins, and all the countries in between are part of it, including India. And what they are working out are economic methods, trading relationships. Nothing to do with the world, what's it called? The one that judges that China wants to go to because of our tariffs.
WTO.
World Trade Organization, WTO. So we're sitting on a whole bunch of things, and inappropriate or inopportune statements can take on new life. Yes.
You mentioned enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine, but what about friend of my enemy? India, from the birth, it has been friend of Russia, United Soviet Union, and that's our enemy, but we still consider India as our friend. How much?
It's complicated, isn't it?
How much can India be trusted? And it is the initiator of changing the petrodollars in BRICS.
Well, and we've gone through a little transition in the last 20 years. We were much closer to Pakistan before, as India was closer to the Soviet Union. And it's reversed. And the unfortunate thing is that it's a little bit like the Irish, the Northern Irish and the Irish. You can't say, if you support one, the other then sees you as the enemy. If U.S. is now much closer to India, then Pakistan sees this as a negative. So, good point. Let's go one back there.
Holy shit.
What salient features of the New World Order would China put into place, do you think?
That's a very good question.
I mean, we have, what, rule of law, freedom of
Yes,
speech.
yes. Well, differing adjustments to that. Because we wrote those rules. And, I mean, Europe was in no position after World War II to be able to contribute to this. The Chinese were having a civil war at the time.
Sure, we adjust.
Attention library patrons, the time is 7:45. We do close at 8 o'clock this evening. Please make your final selections and we'll see you at the checkout desk. Thank you.
Sorry, I forgot to tell them.
All the libraries do it. Yes, but their clocks are 10 minutes ahead. Yes, you got one.
I have two related questions. How it's projected that Africa is going to be by far the fastest population growth over the next 25 years. And that's true in general of the global south, but particularly in Africa, which is economically sort of the least developed, if you want to call it that, and is, you know, as you've mentioned, has many autocracies. And so what implications do you think that will have for how things will play out going forward economically and in terms of, I mean, obviously the US and China are in potentially a battle for the hearts and souls of Africans, which, as well as their checkbooks
Actually, there were
and their resources.
both sides are not dealing with the, well, we think about the hearts and minds, but basically what we need to focus on is the leadership.
Right.
Because that's where the connections are made. That's where we get the supply chains. I can just see European leaders blanching as you talk about the population expansion in Africa. It's frightening.
Well, it's because they're worried they're going to travel north more.
Exactly, because and those European, I mean, Germany absorbed over 1 million Muslims.
Yeah.
What does that do to the culture of Germany? I mean, that's huge.
Well, but Germany is a monolithic in terms of cultural organization, as opposed to the United States, which is multicultural.
Yes, you're right, because those people don't have votes.
So
They're not citizens.
So within Germany, you have somebody thinking of Germans and German culture, which has now been invaded by all of these non-Germans who come in and try to become part of their culture, and that makes it more difficult for them to make a decision than.
See,
That's not an issue unless they don't want to assimilate.
wow,
Well,
guess what?
They don't.
They don't.
I mean, we know that as well.
Sure. Yeah.
You have the Arabs in France, which is also causing issues.
I mean, without stepping on any Armenian toes here, the Armenians are very, you probably don't wear it, are very close in their group.
I was just in England a couple months ago, and the English are complaining that there's so many non-English in England.
Right.
Well, guess where the right-wing sweep comes from? This people who are saying, I want to go back to our basics, who we are, what we stand for. I mean, I'm not endorsing this, but I'm analyzing what I see happening.
Well,
We talk about climate change. You know what the most deadly thing to climate change is? People. People. Rising populations that we have been seeing is the most damaging part of climate change. Those that already have want more. Those that don't have want some. All of that is our building blocks on changing the climate.
So the tangent I had, it has to do with global health. So I'm a physician, work for WHO. Right now, WHO is not something the U.S. is affiliated with as of a week ago. There's how do you think all of these forces are going to affect collaboration on global health issues? Because it's going to have profound implications, especially if there's another pandemic, blah, blah, blah. I mean, economically, it's...
No, very good point, and I don't see common ground. In fact, I see increasingly less common ground
Yeah, that's
in
my
dealing
worry.
with these issues. I said Europe is going to become introspective. We are becoming introspective. We're caught up in the dynamics of what's going on in Washington.
Sure.
Another question?
One back there.
Listening to this whole topic, and I know we're focused in the now, right now, about, geopolitics and stuff like that, but just, if I was writing a Disney movie, okay?
Well, good.
It's gonna have a happy
They have to have a happy ending.
Well, we'll see what you've got to say, because you're a futurist. It's no longer recognized that I picked up on that correctly with the club. But if we had harmony in the world, and ethnicity and ideologies weren't clashing, and we had a superpower whose ideology was imposed but embraced, what would be the motivating factors of humanity to advance humanity if it's not from the technological advancements that we're pushed to guard ourselves from invaders via the war machine, with all of the technology that we got Elon that wants to go to space, which who knows what came first, the Elon or the war machine, So what would be the motivating factor for humanity if harmony, food supplies were good, air was good, what would be the motivating, so everybody wouldn't be in a retirement state from birth?
Woody Allen in the movie, what was it? Was it Bananas?
Yep.
Where they were smoking that little pipe, and they all felt really good. Human nature, we get smarter, we get richer, but we don't get better. We are basically the same humans in terms of we may have larger perspectives on what, but that goes good and bad. Human nature is not, it's not a neutral factor. And this was the ideal of the optimist, that you would be able to create a better human being. Well, I don't believe we can.
So
I think we are stuck with
AI can do it.
Not to go
Yeah.
into
Well, and most go
lunatics,
link it up.
kind of
Human brain.
question. But there's all kinds of talk shows, and I'm not the conspiracy theorist. I like to listen. But is space, and is there a higher power that they actually know how to say we have technology that we can't explain?
Yeah.
And if we can't explain it, we can't go and let it out to humanity, because it may cause an internal crisis.
We're already seeing.
So would it be then the advancement to the unknown? Is that what the motivator would be?
Ray Kurzweil, who was a futurist of some renown, wrote that in 2045, the machines will be smarter than we are. And the next generation of AI is supposed to be sentient. If that happens, the machines will tell us what to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Next week will be Dr. Pablo Toral will be here from Beloit College to talk about global cooperation on climate change. So I hope to see you. And just real quick, if you're interested in a book, we got them for sale over here. $20, which is a bargain. We don't discount it. Or we have copies to check out in the library. Thank you for coming.
Library patrons will be closing in 5 minutes and ask that you bring your